Frank Morrison had always been crystal clear about one thing. He absolutely hated cats. He used to say it all the time to his 8-year-old daughter. "I hate cats. Big cats, little cats, fur balls on your lap, didn't matter. To him, they were nothing but trouble wrapped in fur." But one evening on his way home from work, he spotted 2 tiny bobcat kittens huddled at the edge of a forgotten gravel road. Just a couple of days, he believed. Then they'd go back to the wild where they belonged. But as he drove on, the kittens scrambled up and draped their spotted paws across his shoulder, rubbing against him. His chest tightened. How could a man who had spent his life insisting he hated cats become their fiercest advocate? This is the story of how 2 tiny bobcats not only changed Frank's heart, they changed everything he thought he knew about himself. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Frank Morrison was 63 years old and proud of exactly 3 things: his pristine 1987 Chevy pickup truck, his ability to grill the perfect medium-rare steak, and his absolute unwavering hatred of cats. "Sneaky creatures," he'd mutter whenever the neighbor's tabby dared to cross his lawn. "Nothing but trouble wrapped in fur." His daughter Emily, now 38 and mother to his granddaughter Lily, had heard this refrain her entire life. When she was 8, she'd begged for a kitten. Frank's response had been to buy her a goldfish named Bubbles. When Bubbles died 3 days later, he declared it proof that pets were nothing but heartache waiting to happen. "But Dad," Emily would argue during their weekly dinners, "cats are wonderful companions. Studies show they reduce stress and—" "The only thing cats reduce is the bird population and my patience," Frank would interrupt, sawing into his steak with unnecessary vigor. Little Lily, 8 years old and blessed with her grandfather's stubbornness, would pipe up, "Grandpa Frank, you're just scared of cats." "Scared? Ha-ha!" Frank would boom, his weathered face crinkling. "I survived 2 tours in Vietnam, young lady. I'm not scared of some overgrown hamster with delusions of grandeur." This was the Frank Morrison who, on a drizzly Thursday evening in late October, was driving home from his job at Henderson's hardware store, grumbling about his aching back and thinking about the leftover meatloaf waiting in his refrigerator. The gravel road was a shortcut he'd taken for 20 years, winding through the edges of the Ozark foothills. He knew every pothole, every curve, every— "What in the Sam Hill?" Frank slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding slightly on the wet gravel. There, illuminated in his headlights like actors on a stage, were 2 tiny creatures. At first, he thought they were regular kittens, some irresponsible person dumping their unwanted pets again. But as he squinted through the windshield, wiping away the fog with his sleeve, he realized these weren't house cats. The distinctive tufted ears and spotted coats gave them away. Bobcat Kittens. And they were absolutely, heartbreakingly small. Frank sat in his idling truck for a full minute, arguing with himself. The rational part of his brain said to drive on, call fish and wildlife, let them handle it. These were wild animals, not his problem. But the kittens weren't moving. They sat there, huddled together against the rain, their eyes reflecting his headlights like tiny golden coins. "Damn it all to hell," Frank muttered, throwing the truck into park. He approached slowly, half expecting the kittens to bolt. Instead, they mewed, a sound so pathetic and small that something twisted in Frank's chest. They couldn't have been more than 3 weeks old, their eyes barely open, their spotted coats matted with rain and mud. "Where's your mama, huh?" Frank asked gruffly, scanning the darkening woods. No sign of an adult bobcat. Either she'd abandoned them or, more likely, met with some misfortune. The road saw its share of wildlife casualties. The smaller kitten, barely bigger than Frank's fist, wobbled toward him and collapsed. Its sibling tried to follow but stumbled, crying out in a voice that sounded far too human for Frank's comfort. "Oh, for crying out loud," Frank groaned. He shrugged off his flannel jacket, his favorite naturally, and gently scooped up both kittens. They weighed nothing, just tiny bundles of damp fur and prominent ribs. "This is temporary," he told them sternly. "First thing tomorrow, you're going to a proper wildlife place." The kittens responded by burrowing deeper into his jacket. The drive home was an adventure. Frank had tucked the jacket-wrapped bundle on the passenger seat, but within minutes, the kittens had staged a prison break. The larger one, Frank was already thinking of it as the troublemaker, climbed up his arm and draped itself across his shoulders like a spotted scarf. The smaller one wedged itself between his neck and the seat, purring with the intensity of a tiny diesel engine. "This is exactly why I hate cats," Frank announced to his rearview mirror. "No sense of boundaries." The troublemaker responded by licking his ear. Frank's modest ranch house was dark when he pulled in. He'd lived alone since Margaret passed 5 years ago, and he liked it that way. Quiet, orderly, cat-free. "All right, ground rules," he said, carrying the kittens inside. "No scratching the furniture. Not that you're staying long enough to try. No yowling at 3 a.m., and absolutely no getting attached to me because I don't do cats." The kitten seemed unimpressed by his speech. The troublemaker was already exploring his kitchen counter while the little one had discovered his shoelaces. Frank's first call was to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Branson. The news wasn't good. "Bobcat kittens under 3 pounds?" the woman said. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're not equipped for neonates. They need round-the-clock care, specialized formula. Most don't make it, honestly. Your best bet might be Dr. Williamson at the Mountain View Animal Hospital. She's worked with wildlife before." Frank hung up and glared at the kittens, who were now attempting to climb his leg. "You heard that? Most don't make it. Well, I didn't survive Nam to let 2 walking dust bunnies die on my watch." He called Dr. Williamson, who agreed to see them first thing in the morning. In the meantime, she gave him a list of supplies and instructions that made his head spin. Kitten formula, heating pads, something called stimulation for elimination that sounded downright indecent. "Can't they just use a litter box like normal cats?" Frank asked. Dr. Williamson's laugh was kind but amused. "Mr. Morrison, these babies are probably only 3 weeks old. Their mother would typically assist them. You'll need to use a warm, damp cloth after each feeding too." "Good Lord," Frank interrupted. "What have I gotten myself into?" By midnight, Frank had transformed his spare bathroom into what looked like a feline intensive care unit. He'd driven to the 24-hour Walmart 2 towns over, enduring the raised eyebrows of the cashier as he bought out their entire stock of kitten supplies. "Foster kittens," he'd muttered by way of explanation. "How sweet," the cashier had gushed. "I love a man who loves cats." "I don't love cats," Frank had said firmly. "This is temporary." Now, sitting on his bathroom floor at 1 a.m., trying to convince the smaller kitten to drink from a syringe, Frank wondered if temporary was a relative term. The little one, when had he started thinking of it as peanut, was weak, barely interested in the formula. The troublemaker, okay, rebel, had already figured out the syringe and was demanding seconds. "Come on, Peanut," Frank coaxed, dabbing formula on the kitten's lips. "You gotta eat, buddy. How else are you gonna grow up big and strong and go back to the wild where you belong?" Peanut finally latched on, drinking with painful slowness. Frank found himself holding his breath, counting each tiny swallow. When Emily called the next morning, Frank was exhausted but triumphant. Both kittens had survived the night. "Dad, you sound terrible. Are you sick?" "I'm fine," Frank said, stifling a yawn. "Just didn't sleep well." "Okay. Well, I wanted to confirm Sunday dinner. Lily's been practicing her joke repertoire for you." In the background, Frank could hear Rebel launching another assault on the scratch post he'd hastily constructed at 3 a.m. "About Sunday, I might need to reschedule." "Reschedule? Dad, you haven't missed Sunday dinner in 5 years. What's going on?" Frank looked at Peanut, curled in his lap, finally sleeping peacefully after his morning feeding. "It's complicated." The visit to Dr. Williamson confirmed what Frank had suspected. The kittens were malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from parasites. Peanut especially was touch and go. "I'll be honest, Mr. Morrison," Dr. Williamson said, her kind eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses. "The survival rate for orphaned bobcats this young is maybe 20%. Peanut's the runt, and he's struggling. Are you sure you want to take this on?" Frank looked at the two kittens in the carrier. Rebel was grooming Peanut with the dedication of a tiny mother, trying to wake his lethargic sibling. "What would happen if I said no?" "We'd have to euthanize, without a wildlife rehabilitator willing to take them." "Give me the damn permit application," Frank growled. The next 2 weeks were a blur of sleepless nights, formula feedings every 2 hours, and more laundry than Frank had done since Margaret's illness. He learned to read the kittens' cries like a language, hungry, cold, lonely, or just wanting attention. He became an expert at taking their temperatures, mixing formula to the perfect consistency, and the dreaded stimulation process that he refused to discuss with anyone ever. Rebel thrived, growing rounder and more mischievous by the day. He figured out how to escape the bathroom and would regularly ambush Frank's ankles. Peanut struggled, some days refusing food entirely, his tiny body barely holding on. It was during one particularly bad night that Emily discovered Frank's secret. She'd used her spare key, worried when he hadn't answered her calls for 2 days. "Dad?" she called, finding the living room empty. She followed the sound of voices to the bathroom and froze in the doorway. Frank was sitting in the bathtub, fully clothed, with Peanut cradled against his chest. He was singing, actually singing, some unrecognizable lullaby while Rebel played with his shoelaces. "Dad?" Frank looked up, his eyes red with exhaustion. "He won't eat," he said simply. "Been trying for 6 hours. If he doesn't eat..." Emily had never seen her father cry. Not at her wedding, not even at Mom's funeral. But now, holding a dying bobcat kitten, tears rolled down his weathered cheeks. "Oh, Dad," Emily whispered, climbing into the bathtub beside him. "Let me help." Together, they worked through the night. Emily ran to the store for supplies while Frank kept Peanut warm. They tried everything: different formula temperatures, various feeding positions, even playing YouTube videos of mother bobcats calling their young. Finally, at dawn, Peanut stirred. His tiny pink tongue darted out, tasting the formula on Frank's finger. Then, miracle of miracles, he began to nurse. "That's it," Frank whispered. "That's my tough guy." Emily watched her father, the man who hated cats, cry with relief as Peanut drank. Rebel, not to be left out, climbed onto Frank's shoulder and began grooming his ear. "So," Emily said carefully, "still hate cats?" Frank snorted. "These aren't cats. They're different." Uh-huh. The story spread through their small town like wildfire. Frank Morrison, the grumpiest cat hater in 3 counties, was raising Bobcat Kittens. People started dropping by with advice, supplies, and barely concealed amusement. "Heard you went and got yourself some cats, Frank," his poker buddy Harold said, grinning. "They're not pets," Frank insisted. "I'm rehabilitating them, for release, back to the wild." Sure, Harold said, watching as Rebel climbed up Frank's leg and settled on his lap. "That why you built them that castle in your living room?" Frank glanced at the elaborate climbing structure he'd spent 3 days constructing. "That's enrichment for their wild instincts." By week 4, both kittens were thriving. Peanut had caught up to his brother in size, and both were displaying the playful, curious nature of healthy young bobcats. Frank had officially received his wildlife rehabilitation permit and had connected with other rehabbers for advice. "You'll need to start limiting human contact," one advised. "They need to maintain their wild instincts." Frank agreed in principle. In practice, it was harder. Rebel had claimed Frank's recliner as his personal throne, and Peanut had developed a habit of sleeping on Frank's chest, purring like a tiny motorboat. Sunday dinners resumed, with one addition. Lily was absolutely enchanted by the kittens. "Grandpa Frank," she announced one evening, watching the kittens wrestle, "you love them." "I don't love them," Frank protested. "I'm just responsible for them." Lily gave him a look that was pure 8-year-old skepticism. "You made them matching collars." "Those are temporary identification bands, with their names embroidered on them. Safety precaution. In glitter thread." The store was out of regular thread. Emily hid her smile behind her hand. Frank had not only made the collars, but had also created individual photo albums for each kitten, documenting their growth. She'd found them while looking for coffee filters. As the weeks turned to months, the kittens grew from palm-sized bundles into lanky teenagers. Their spots became more pronounced, their ears more tufted. They were undeniably wild animals, but they were also undeniably Frank's. The day came when Dr. Williamson declared them ready for the next phase, outdoor enclosure training. Frank had spent a small fortune building a massive enclosed area in his backyard, complete with logs, hiding spots, and a small pool. "This is good," he told himself, watching them explore. "They need to be wild. This is what's best for them." But at night, when the house was quiet and his bed felt too empty, Frank would slip outside and sit by the enclosure. The kittens would run to him, rubbing against the fence, purring their diesel engine purrs. "I'm not keeping you," he'd tell them. "You belong out there, in the forest, free." Rebel would stick his paw through the fence, batting at Frank's hand. Peanut would do his best to climb Frank's leg through the chain link. It was Emily who finally confronted him. "Dad, have you actually contacted anyone about releasing them?" Frank shuffled his feet. "Been busy? Dad, they're not ready yet. Rebel's hunting instincts aren't, and Peanut's still small for his age." "Dad, they're 7 months old. They're the size of full-grown house cats. When exactly will they be ready?" Frank couldn't answer. The truth was, He couldn't imagine his life without them anymore. The morning feeding routine, the evening playtime, the way Peanut still insisted on his goodnight ear scratch. It had all become as essential as breathing. The decision was taken out of his hands when Rebel escaped. Frank had been cleaning the enclosure. Sure, he'd secured the door. But Rebel was clever, had been watching, learning. One moment he was there, the next, gone. "Rebel!" Frank shouted, panic rising in his throat. "Rebel, you get back here right now!" He searched for hours, tramping through the woods behind his house, calling until his voice was hoarse. Emily joined him, then Harold and his wife, then half the neighborhood. As darkness fell, Frank felt something inside him breaking. "It's what you wanted," Emily said gently. "For them to be wild." "Not like this," Frank said. "Not without—" "I didn't get to say goodbye." He sat on his porch all night, leaving the enclosure door open, hoping. Peanut cried, calling for his brother, and Frank had never felt so helpless. At dawn, as Frank dozed in his chair, something woke him, a familiar weight on his lap. Rebel sat there, muddy and full of brambles, purring as if he'd never left. "You came back," Frank whispered, gathering the bobcat in his arms. "You came back." That's when Frank knew. These weren't wild animals anymore, not fully. They were caught between two worlds, just like him. Too wild for a house, too tame for the forest. The solution came from Dr. Williamson. There's a wildlife education center about 2 hours north. They work with animals that can't be released, human-imprinted ones. The kittens could live there, help teach people about bobcats, conservation, and, she smiled, they allow their rehabilitation volunteers to visit regularly. Frank made the call that afternoon. The day he drove Rebel and Peanut to their new home was bittersweet. The enclosure at the education center was massive, natural, perfect. The staff was knowledgeable and kind. Other bobcats lived nearby, potential friends. "They'll be happy here," the director assured him, "and you can visit every weekend if you want." As Frank said goodbye, Rebel climbed his leg one last time, settling on his shoulder. Peanut rubbed against his hand, purring. They weren't afraid or anxious. Somehow they knew Frank would be back. The drive home was quiet. The house felt emptier than it had since Margaret died, but on the kitchen counter sat a photo. Frank with 2 bobcat kittens draped over his shoulders, all 3 looking utterly content. The next Sunday, Lily bounded into the house. "Grandpa Frank, can we go visit Rebel and Peanut?" "Already?" Frank grumbled. "I just saw them yesterday." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Yesterday? I thought you said you weren't attached." Frank harumphed. "I'm not. I just want to make sure they're settling in okay." "For the 4th time this week?" "The director says consistency is important. The director says you're there so often they're thinking of giving you your own parking space." As they drove to the center, Lily piped up from the back seat. "Grandpa Frank? Do you still hate cats?" Frank glanced at her in the rearview mirror, then at Emily, who was trying not to smile. He thought about the past months, the sleepless nights, the fear, the joy, the love he hadn't expected to feel again. "You know what, kiddo?" he said finally. "I think maybe I just hadn't met the right cats yet." At the education center, Rebel and Peanut were waiting by the fence, having learned the sound of Frank's truck. They chuffed and rubbed against his hands through the chain link, and Frank felt that familiar tightness in his chest. Not grief this time, but something else. Something that felt a lot like coming home. "Mr. Morrison," one of the young volunteers called out. "Perfect timing. We're about to do the afternoon feeding demonstration. Would you like to help? The visitors love hearing your rescue story." Frank looked at the gathering crowd of school children, their eyes bright with curiosity. He thought about all the things he used to believe, all the walls he'd built around his heart. "Yeah," he said, smiling as Rebel did his signature shoulder climb move, making the kids gasp in delight. "Yeah, I'd like that." As he began telling the story of a grumpy old man and two tiny bobcats on a rainy Thursday night, Frank realized something. He'd spent so many years insisting he hated cats that he'd never considered the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong about a lot of things. But if being wrong meant ending up here, with Peanut purring against his chest and Rebel playing to the crowd, with Emily and Lily beaming at him with pride, with a purpose that got him up every morning and a love he'd thought he'd never feel again. Well, Frank Morrison had never been happier to be wrong in his entire life. And that's how the man who hated cats became the volunteer bobcat educator who could often be heard telling visitors, "Now people say cats are aloof and selfish. But let me tell you about the night two little bobcats taught this stubborn old fool about love." The cats, for their part, seemed to agree. After all, they'd picked him first.